The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand hallway of Kensington Palace as William paced nervously near the tall windows. His usually composed demeanor had given way to visible anxiety, and Kate noticed the way his hands trembled slightly. As he adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, they had been married for over a decade, yet she had rarely seen him this unsettled. "The children will be fine," Kate whispered, placing a gentle hand on his arm. But even as she spoke the words, she felt her own heart racing. Today was different. From any other day they had faced together as a family, the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago had changed everything. And now they stood on the precipice of a revelation that could alter their lives forever. William turned to face his wife, his blue eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and fear that made Kate's chest tighten. They had always been a team, facing public scrutiny and private challenges with united strength. But this particular morning felt heavier than usual, weighted with possibilities they had never dared to imagine. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, and both William and Kate straightened instinctively. Their private secretary, James, approached with measured steps, carrying a manila envelope that seemed to hold more significance than its simple appearance suggested. Behind him walked Dr. Richardson, a woman in her 60s whose kind eyes had witnessed countless family reunions over her 40-year career in genealogical research. "Your Royal Highnesses," Dr. Richardson began, her voice gentle but professional, "I want to prepare you for what we might discover today. Sometimes the truth we seek isn't always the truth we expect to find." Her words hung in the air like a warning, and Kate felt William's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in a familiar gesture of support. The story had begun months earlier, when William received an unexpected phone call from a man claiming to be conducting family research. At first, William had dismissed it as another attempt by someone seeking attention or money. The royal family received hundreds of such calls each year, most of them baseless claims or elaborate hoaxes designed to extract some benefit from their proximity to the crown. But this call had been different. The man, who identified himself as Thomas Whitmore, spoke with quiet conviction rather than desperate pleading. He had mentioned details that weren't public knowledge, specifics about William's late mother, Diana, that only someone with genuine insider information could have known. More importantly, he had asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to share what he had discovered. Thomas explained that he had been researching his own family tree when he stumbled upon documents that suggested a connection to the royal family that went much deeper than anyone had ever suspected. He claimed to have found evidence of a relationship that had been hidden for decades, one that involved people very close to Diana during her younger years. Initially, William had wanted to ignore the entire matter. His life was complicated enough, without chasing shadows from the past, but Kate had encouraged him to at least investigate, pointing out that if there was even a small chance of uncovering something meaningful about his mother's history, it was worth exploring. They had hired Dr. Richardson, one of the most respected genealogical researchers in the country, to look into Thomas's claims. For weeks she had pored over birth records, marriage certificates, hospital documents, and personal correspondence. She had traveled to 3 different countries, interviewed elderly relatives, and examined DNA evidence with scientific precision. Now, as they stood in the palace hallway, Dr. Richardson held the results of her exhaustive investigation, the envelope. In her hands contained answers to questions William hadn't even known he should be asking about his family's history. "Before we proceed," Dr. Richardson continued, "I want you both to understand that some discoveries can't be undone. Once you know certain truths, they become part of your story forever. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Kate squeezed William's hand tighter, feeling the slight tremor that ran through his fingers. She thought about their children, Charlotte and George and Louis, and wondered how any revelations today might affect their understanding of their heritage. The royal family had always been subject to intense scrutiny, but this felt different, more personal somehow. William nodded slowly. "We need to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it is, we need to know." Dr. Richardson led them toward William's private study, a room filled with photographs of his mother and personal mementos that held deep emotional significance. The irony wasn't lost on Kate that they were about to potentially learn something new about Diana in a room dedicated to preserving her memory. As they walked, Kate noticed how the familiar portraits seemed to watch them with knowing expressions. As if the painted eyes held secrets they were finally ready to reveal. She had always felt close to Diana, despite never having met her. But today she wondered if that connection might run deeper than she had ever imagined. The study door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, Kate could see Thomas Whitmore sitting in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. He was a man in his early 70s, with silver hair and gentle features that seemed somehow familiar, though Kate was certain she had never met him before. William paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the door handle. This was the moment of truth, the point where speculation would give way to fact. Whatever lay beyond that door would either confirm their hopes or shatter assumptions. They had held for years. Kate studied her husband's profile, noting the way his jaw was set with determination despite the uncertainty in his eyes. She had fallen in love with this man, partly because of his strength in the face of adversity, but also because of his capacity for hope, even when circumstances seemed impossible. Together, she whispered, and William turned the handle as the door swung open, revealing Thomas Whitmore's expectant face and Dr. Richardson's careful documentation spread across William's desk. Kate felt her breath catch in her throat. The next few moments would either bring them closure or open up entirely new questions about their family's hidden history. The room fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, marking the seconds before their lives potentially changed forever. Thomas Whitmore stood slowly as William and Kate entered the study, his weathered hands gripping a worn leather portfolio that looked as though it had traveled through decades of careful preservation. His eyes met William's with an intensity that made Kate's heart skip, and she noticed immediately how those eyes held the same deep blue shade as her husband's. "Your Royal Highnesses," Thomas said, his voice carrying a slight tremor of emotion. "I cannot thank you enough for agreeing to see me. I know how unusual this situation must seem." He gestured toward the chair across from him, and William settled into it while Kate chose the seat beside her husband. Close enough to offer silent support, Dr. Richardson moved to stand behind William's desk, where she had arranged several documents in neat piles. Each stack seemed to represent a different piece of the puzzle they were about to assemble. Kate noticed photographs mixed in with the papers, some in color but many in the faded black and white of earlier decades. "Before we begin," Dr. Richardson said, adjusting her glasses, "I want to walk you through what Mr. Whitmore discovered and how I was able to verify his findings. The story we're about to tell you spans several generations and involves people whose names you may recognize." Thomas opened his portfolio with careful reverence, revealing the first document. "It started when I was trying to trace my late wife's family tree," he began, his voice growing stronger. "Margaret passed away 2 years ago, and I wanted to create a complete family history for our grandchildren. She had always been secretive about her childhood, saying only that her family had worked for wealthy people in London." He pulled out a faded birth certificate, its edges yellowed with age. "This is Margaret's birth certificate from 1952. As you can see, her mother's name is listed as Sarah Whitmore, but there's something unusual here." He pointed to a section that had been partially obscured. The original surname was crossed out and replaced. "When I began investigating why, I discovered that Sarah's real name was Sarah Spencer." Kate felt William stiffen beside her at the mention of his mother's maiden name. The Spencer family history was well documented, but the idea that there might be unknown branches of the family tree was both intriguing and unsettling. Dr. Richardson stepped forward with another document. "I was able to confirm through parish records that Sarah Spencer was indeed related to the Spencer family. She was Diana's father's younger sister, making her Diana's aunt. However, Sarah had been effectively erased from the family records after what the documents refer to as a scandal in the early 1950s. "What kind of scandal?" "Yeah?" William asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Thomas exchanged a glance with Dr. Richardson before continuing. "Sarah became pregnant at 17 by a man the family deemed unsuitable. Rather than face the social consequences, the Spencer family sent her away to have the baby in secret. They arranged for her to take a different name and start a new life, far from their social circle. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. Kate reached for William's hand, feeling the way his fingers had gone cold. If this was true, it meant that Diana had an aunt she never knew about, and by extension, William had family members he had never met. The baby Sarah had, Dr. Richardson continued gently, was Margaret, which means that Margaret was Diana's cousin, and Mr. Whitmore's late wife was your mother's first cousin. Kate watched as William processed this information, his expressions cycling through disbelief, wonder, and something that looked like grief. So you're saying that my mother had family she never knew about? That there were people who could have been part of her life? Thomas nodded, his eyes misting slightly. Margaret spent her entire life wondering about her mother's family. Sarah would never speak of them, saying only that they came from a different world and that it was better to leave the past behind. Margaret died never knowing that she was related to Princess Diana. Dr. Richardson produced several photographs from her collection. These are pictures of Margaret throughout her life. I think you'll find the resemblance quite striking. She handed the photos to William, and Kate leaned in to look at them together. The woman in the photographs bore an unmistakable resemblance to Diana. The same blonde hair, the same expressive eyes, and most remarkably, the same gentle smile that had made Diana beloved around the world. In several of the later photographs, Margaret was shown with her children and grandchildren, all of whom shared subtle family traits that were now impossible to ignore. "This is incredible," Kate whispered, studying a photograph of Margaret from the 1980s. "She looks so much like your mother, William." Thomas reached into his portfolio again and withdrew what appeared to be a letter. "There's more," he said quietly. "After Margaret died, I was going through her personal belongings when I found this hidden in the back of her jewelry box. It's a letter she never sent." He handed the letter to William with shaking hands. The envelope was addressed to Princess Diana at Kensington Palace. Dated just 6 months before Diana's death in 1997, the letter had never been opened by its intended recipient. William's hands trembled as he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the delicate stationery inside. Kate could see that the handwriting was feminine and precise, each word carefully chosen. William began to read aloud, his voice catching with emotion. "Your Royal Highness, I hope you will forgive the presumption of a stranger writing to you, but I have reason to believe that we may be family. My mother Sarah was born a Spencer, though she took a different name when she was very young. I have spent my life wondering about the family she left behind, and when I see your photographs in the newspapers, I cannot help but notice the resemblance between us." William paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I do not write seeking anything from you except perhaps the knowledge of whether my mother's stories were true. She spoke of a family with great estates and important connections, but she was always too ashamed of the circumstances of her departure to tell me their names. If there is any truth to what I believe, then I wanted you to know that you have family who think of you with great affection, even from a distance." The letter went on to describe Margaret's life, her children, and her hope that someday the family might be reunited. She had included several photographs and even a small family tree. She had constructed based on the limited information her mother had provided over the years. "She never sent it," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she was afraid of being rejected or dismissed as someone seeking attention. Margaret was a very private person, and the idea of reaching out to royalty terrified her, even if she believed they were family." Kate felt tears pricking at her eyes as she imagined Diana receiving such a letter during one of the most difficult periods of her life. The knowledge that she had family members who cared about her from afar might have brought her some comfort during her struggles. Dr. Richardson cleared her throat gently. "There's one more thing," she said, producing a final document. "Mr. Whitmore's research led me to investigate further, and I discovered that Margaret wasn't Sarah's only child. There were others." The weight of Dr. Richardson's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Kate watched as William's face went pale. She could practically see his mind racing as he tried to process the magnitude of what they were learning. The discovery of one unknown relative had been shocking enough, but the possibility of others felt overwhelming. "Others," William repeated, his voice barely audible. "How many others?" Dr. Richardson consulted her notes carefully. Based on the records I was able to locate, Sarah had 3 children over the course of 15 years. Margaret was the first, born in 1952. Then there was a son, David, born in 1957. And finally another daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1967. Thomas nodded solemnly. I only learned about David and Elizabeth after Margaret passed away, she had mentioned. Having siblings once or twice over the years, but I always assumed they had lost touch the way families sometimes do. It wasn't until I started this research that I realized how deliberately the family had been separated. Kate found herself thinking about her own children and how devastating it would be if they were forced apart by circumstances beyond their control. The tragedy of Sarah's situation began to take on new dimensions as she imagined a young woman trying to build a life while being cut off from everything she had known. What happened to them? Kate asked gently. David and Elizabeth. Dr. Richardson turned to a new set of documents. David emigrated to Australia in the late 1970s. He became a teacher and raised a family there. According to the records I found, he passed away in 2019. But he had 2 children who were still living in Sydney. Elizabeth moved to Scotland, where she worked as a nurse for most of her career. She's actually still alive, though she's now in her late 50s and has been dealing with some health issues. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Kate could see that William was struggling with the emotional weight of learning that his mother had living relatives she never knew about, and that some of those relatives were still alive and potentially reachable. Thomas opened his portfolio again and withdrew a folder marked with Elizabeth's name. I managed to contact Elizabeth about 6 months ago, he said quietly. It took some convincing for her to believe that I wasn't trying to scam her, but eventually she agreed to share what she knew about the family history. He handed William a photograph of a woman with graying blonde hair and familiar blue eyes. She was standing in what appeared to be a garden, smiling at whoever was taking the picture. The resemblance to Diana was subtle but unmistakable, visible in the shape of her face and the way she held herself. Elizabeth grew up, knowing she had siblings, but was told they had all been adopted by different families and that finding them would be impossible. Thomas continued. Her mother, Sarah, became increasingly bitter about the family's separation as she got older. According to Elizabeth, Sarah spent her final years consumed with regret about the choices she felt forced to make. Dr. Richardson added, Elizabeth has been living quietly in Edinburgh, working as a nurse until her retirement 5 years ago. She has 2 grown children of her own, both of whom are successful professionals. She never married, dedicating herself to her career and caring for her mother until Sarah passed away in 1995. Kate noticed that William was staring at Elizabeth's photograph with an intensity that made her heart ache for him. She knew he was, thinking about all the years that had passed, all the opportunities for connection that had been lost, and all the ways his mother's life might have been different if she had known about these relatives. Has Elizabeth been told about this meeting? William asked, his voice carefully controlled. Thomas nodded. She knows that we were planning to approach you with what we had discovered. At first, she was terrified by the idea. Like Margaret, she's a very private person who has spent her life avoiding any kind of attention. But when I explained how important this might be for understanding your mother's story, she agreed to cooperate with the research. Dr. Richardson pulled out another document. Elizabeth provided some remarkable insights into the family dynamics that led to the separation. According to what Sarah told her, the Spencer family wasn't just concerned about social scandal. There were financial considerations as well. The family was going through some economic difficulties in the 1950s, and additional children represented a burden they felt they couldn't handle. So they just abandoned her? Kate asked, unable to keep the indignation out of her voice. They sent her away and pretended she didn't exist. It was a different time, Thomas said sadly. The social pressures were enormous, and unmarried mothers faced incredible stigma. But yes, essentially that's what happened. Sarah was given a small amount of money and told never to contact the family again. She was basically erased from their history. William finally looked up from Elizabeth's photograph. Does she want to meet us? He asked quietly. Thomas exchanged a glance with Dr. Richardson. She's conflicted about it, he admitted. Part of her has dreamed about this possibility her entire life. But she's also afraid of disrupting your lives or bringing unwanted attention to herself. She's lived very quietly for decades, and the idea of being connected to the royal family terrifies her. Kate could understand Elizabeth's hesitation. Now, the level of scrutiny that came with any connection to their family was intense and often overwhelming. But she also felt a strong pull toward this woman who represented a living link to William's mother. "There's something else," Dr. Richardson said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "During my research, I discovered that Sarah kept detailed journals throughout her life. Elizabeth inherited them when her mother died, and they contain information about the Spencer family that has never been made public. She produced a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Sarah wrote extensively about her memories of the family estate, about conversations she overheard as a child, and about the circumstances that led to her departure. Some of what she recorded could provide new insights into your mother's family history." William reached for the journal with trembling hands. "May I?" he asked, and Dr. Richardson nodded. He opened it carefully to a random page and began to read silently, his expression changing as he absorbed his great-aunt's words. After several minutes, he looked up with tears in his eyes. "She writes about the Spencer family traditions, about the games the children used to play, about the way the house smelled during Christmas. These are things my mother never knew, stories she'd never heard." His voice broke slightly. Sarah remembered everything, even after all those years of separation. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. Elizabeth said that her mother used to tell her stories about the grand house and the important visitors who came to stay. She remembered specific details about the furniture, the artwork, even the way certain rooms were decorated. It was as if she had preserved every memory as a way of staying connected to the family she lost. Kate felt overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. Here was a woman who had spent her entire life carrying memories of a family that had rejected her. Yet she had preserved those memories with loving care and passed them on to her children. It seemed both heartbreaking and beautiful. "What do we do now?" William asked, looking around the room at the faces of the people who had brought this incredible story to light. "How do we move forward with this information?" Dr. Richardson carefully gathered the scattered documents on William's desk, organizing them into a neat pile before addressing his question. The afternoon light streaming through the study windows had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room and adding weight to the moment. "The decision of how to proceed is entirely yours," she said gently. "But I should tell you that there are practical considerations we need to discuss. Elizabeth's health situation is one of them." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Elizabeth was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease about 18 months ago," he said quietly. "Her memory is still quite good now, but her doctors have warned that the progression could be unpredictable. If you want to meet her and hear her stories firsthand, time may be a factor." Kate felt her heart clench at this news. The idea that they might lose this connection before they had a chance to fully explore it seemed cruelly unfair. At William, and could see him wrestling with the same thoughts. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his voice growing more hesitant. "Elizabeth has been living alone since her retirement, and her children have been concerned about her isolation. They've been trying to convince her to move to a care facility, but she's resisted because she doesn't want to leave Edinburgh. Learning about this family connection has actually given her a new sense of purpose." William set down Sarah's journal and looked directly at Thomas. "What does she need?" he asked simply. "She doesn't need anything in terms of money or support," Thomas quickly clarified. "Her pension and savings are adequate for her needs. What she wants is something much more complex. She wants to understand her place in the family story, and she wants to share what she knows before her memory begins to fade." Dr. Richardson pulled out a folder marked with official-looking seals. "I've prepared a complete genealogical report that documents all of our findings. The DNA evidence confirms the family relationships, and the paper trail supports everything. Mr. Whitmore discovered this could be submitted to the royal genealogists for official recognition if that's something you choose to pursue." Kate could see that William was overwhelmed by the weight of these decisions. As someone who had grown up in the public eye, he understood better than most how any acknowledgement of this family connection would inevitably become public knowledge, with all the scrutiny and speculation that would follow. "What about David's Children in Australia? William asked. Have they been contacted? Thomas nodded. I spoke with both of them. David's son Michael is a doctor in Sydney, and his daughter Patricia is a lawyer in Melbourne. They were fascinated by the family history, but initially skeptical about the royal connection. However, once Dr. Richardson shared the documentation with them, they became very interested in being part of this story. They're both very accomplished individuals, Dr. Richardson added. Michael specializes in pediatric cardiology, and Patricia focuses on family law. Neither of them seems interested in seeking attention or advantage from the family connection. They simply want to understand their heritage. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where his children often played. Kate knew he was thinking about how this discovery might affect Charlotte, George, and Louis, and what it might mean for their understanding of their grandmother's family. There's a practical matter we should discuss, Kate said, addressing the room while keeping her eyes on her husband. If we acknowledge this family connection publicly, it will change Elizabeth's life completely. The media attention alone could be overwhelming for someone in her condition. Thomas leaned forward earnestly. Elizabeth and I have talked about that extensively. She understands the risks, but she also feels a strong obligation to preserve the family history while she still can. She's actually been working on writing down everything she remembers about her mother's stories, creating a kind of family memoir. Dr. Richardson opened another folder and withdrew what appeared to be a handwritten manuscript. Elizabeth has been incredibly diligent about documenting everything. She's written over 200 pages of family memories, stories her mother told, her and her own reflections on growing up as part of this hidden branch of the Spencer family. William turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. I'd like to read what she's written, he said quietly. I think Kate and I need some time to discuss how we want to handle this situation. Of course, Thomas said immediately. Understand that this is an enormous decision for your family. Elizabeth feels the same way. She's actually written you a letter. He reached into his portfolio and withdrew an envelope, addressed in the same careful handwriting they had seen in the journal. Kate accepted the letter and noticed that Elizabeth had used formal stationery, as if she understood the significance of the communication. The envelope was sealed with wax, an old-fashioned touch that somehow seemed appropriate for the gravity of the moment. Why she wanted me to give this to you, regardless of whether you decided to meet her, Thomas explained. It's her way of reaching across the years to make a connection with her nephew, even if it's only through words on paper. William returned to his chair and took the letter from Kate. His hands were steadier now, as if the decision to take time to consider their options had calmed his nerves. He opened the envelope carefully, unfolding several pages of closely written text. Would you like me to read it aloud? Asked Kate, who nodded. Encouragingly. William cleared his throat and began. My dear William, I hope you will forgive the familiarity. But after learning that you are my nephew, I find I cannot think of you simply as your Royal Highness. I am writing this letter not knowing whether we will ever meet, but hoping that these words might somehow bridge the years of separation that have kept our family apart. He paused, his voice catching slightly before continuing. I want you to know that your mother was never forgotten by our side of the family. My mother, Sarah, spoke of the Spencer family often, always with a mixture of love and sadness. She followed Diana's life through newspapers and television, feeling proud of her accomplishments, but heartbroken that she couldn't share in them directly. Kate watched William's face as he read, seeing the emotion building behind his careful composure. This letter represented something he had never expected to receive. Words from someone who had loved his mother from a distance, who had watched her triumphs and tragedies with the eyes of family. Sarah used to say that Diana had the Spencer spirit. William continued reading. She recognized something in your mother's compassion and determination that reminded her of the family she had lost. When Diana died, Sarah grieved as deeply as if she had lost her own daughter. The room fell completely silent except for the gentle ticking of the clock and the sound of William's voice. Dr. Richardson and Thomas seemed to understand that they were witnessing something deeply personal, a moment of connection across decades of separation. I know that learning about our existence might be difficult for you, William read on. We represent a part of your mother's story that she never knew, and I understand how painful that must be. But I hope you might also see us as a gift from her memory, a way of discovering new aspects of the family legacy she left behind." Elizabeth's letter went on to describe her own life, her career as a nurse, and her deep desire to contribute something meaningful to the family's story before her. Memory began to fail. She wrote about her dreams of meeting William and Kate, but also about her understanding if such a meeting wasn't possible. As William finished reading the letter, Kate could see tears in his eyes. The weight of all these revelations seemed to have settled on him fully, and she knew he was struggling with the complexity of emotions that came with discovering family he had never known existed. 3 weeks had passed since the revelations in William's study, and the weight of the decision had pressed heavily on both William and Kate during that time. They had spent countless hours discussing the implications, reading through Elizabeth's memoir, and considering how this discovery might affect their children and their public responsibilities. Kate found William in the garden early one morning, sitting on the bench where Diana used to read to him when he was a child. He was holding Elizabeth's letter. She had read dozens of times since that afternoon with Thomas and Dr. Richardson. The morning mist hadn't yet lifted, and the garden felt peaceful and private in a way that was increasingly rare in there. "Lives, I've made a decision," William said quietly as Kate settled beside him on the bench. "I want to meet her. I need to meet her." Kate had known this moment would come. Over the past weeks, she had watched her husband process the grief of learning that his mother had family members she never knew about, alongside the joy of discovering that those family members were real, accessible, and eager to connect. The pull of that connection had proven stronger than his concerns about publicity and complications. "I think that's the right choice," Kate said, taking his hand. "Your mother would want you to know these people, and they deserve to know you." William nodded, then pulled out his phone to call Dr. Richardson. Within hours, arrangements were being made for a private meeting that would take place away from London, in a location where Elizabeth would feel comfortable and where they could have the privacy necessary for such an emotional reunion. 2 days later, William and Kate found themselves driving through the Scottish countryside toward a small cottage outside Edinburgh where Elizabeth had agreed to meet them. Thomas had arranged for the location through a friend who owned the property, ensuring they would have complete privacy and no risk of media attention as their car pulled into the gravel driveway. Kate could see a modest stone cottage with a well-tended garden and smoke rising from the chimney. It looked like something from a storybook, peaceful and welcoming in the way that only old houses could be. Elizabeth was waiting by the front door, and Kate's breath caught when she saw her. In person, for the first time, the family resemblance was even more striking in real life. Elizabeth had Diana's height and graceful posture, and when she smiled nervously as they approached, Kate could see the same warmth that had made Diana beloved around the world. Her graying blonde hair was styled simply, and she wore a blue dress that brought out the familiar Spencer blue eyes. "Your Royal Highnesses," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling slightly as she offered a small curtsy. "I cannot believe this day has finally come." William stepped forward and gently took her hands. "Please call me William," he said softly. They were family. The word hung in the air between them, and Kate could see tears forming in Elizabeth's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Kate found herself thinking about all the years of separation that had led to this moment. All the missed opportunities for connection that were finally being addressed. Thomas emerged from the cottage, followed by Dr. Richardson, who had come to facilitate the meeting and provide any historical context that might be needed. There was also an older woman Kate didn't recognize, someone with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor who seemed comfortable in Elizabeth's presence. "This is my dear friend Margaret," Elizabeth explained, noticing Kate's questioning look. "She's been helping me prepare for today, and she's also served as my informal caregiver since my diagnosis. I hope you don't mind that she's here." "Of course not," Kate said warmly. "We're grateful to anyone who has been taking care of you." They moved inside the cottage, which was decorated with photographs and mementos that told the story of Elizabeth's life. Kate noticed several pictures of Diana that Elizabeth had clearly treasured over the years, as well as photographs of people who were presumably Elizabeth's own children and grandchildren. Elizabeth led them to a sitting area near the fireplace. where she had prepared tea and arranged several photo albums on a low table. "I wanted to show you pictures of our family," she said, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the purpose of their visit. "I have photographs of my mother, Sarah, and some of David from when we were young. I thought you might like to see what your mother's relatives looked like." William settled into a chair across from Elizabeth, and Kate took the seat beside him. As Elizabeth opened the first photo album, Kate could see that her hands were shaking slightly. Whether from nerves or from her medical condition, it was impossible to tell. The first photograph was of Sarah as a young woman, probably around the age of 20. She was standing in front of what appeared to be a grand house, wearing a simple dress and smiling at the camera. The resemblance to Diana was unmistakable, not just in her physical features, but in the way she carried herself and the brightness in her eyes. "This was taken about a year before I was born," Elizabeth said softly. "My mother kept this picture her entire life, even though looking at it made her sad. She said it reminded her of the person she used to be before everything changed." Oh, William studied the photograph intently. "She looks so young," he said quietly. "So much like my mother." Elizabeth turned the page to reveal more photographs of Sarah with her children. There were pictures of David as a toddler, and later photos of Elizabeth herself as a baby. But what struck Kate most powerfully were the photographs that showed Sarah with all three of her children together. "These were rare," Elizabeth explained, "because the family had been separated when Elizabeth was still very young." "My mother tried so hard to keep us together," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking slightly. "But the financial pressures were too great, and she didn't have any support from the Spencer family. She was forced to make impossible choices." Elizabeth turned to another page, revealing a photograph that made William gasp audibly. It showed Sarah holding a baby while two young children played at her feet. The woman in the picture bore such a strong resemblance to Diana that for a moment it seemed as though they were looking at a photograph of William's mother herself. "This is the last picture of all of us together," Elizabeth said, touching the photograph gently. "It was about 2 years old. David was 5, and Margaret was 7. After this, we were separated and didn't see each other again for many years." Kate could see that William was struggling to contain his emotions. The tragedy of the situation seemed to hit him with full force as he looked at these images of his mother's family, torn apart by circumstances and social pressures that seemed almost incomprehensible from a modern perspective. "What happened to cause the final separation?" Kate asked gently. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to tell a difficult story. "My mother became ill when I was 3. Nothing serious, just a prolonged case of influenza, but she couldn't work for several weeks. Without her income, she couldn't pay rent or buy food for all of us. She had to make a choice about which children she could keep and which ones needed to be placed elsewhere temporarily." Thomas leaned forward from his chair near the window. According to the records Dr. Richardson found, Sarah tried repeatedly to contact the Spencer family during this crisis. She wrote letters begging for help, not for herself but for her children. Every letter was returned unopened. The Spencer family had made their position clear, Dr. Richardson added quietly. As far as they were concerned, Sarah and her children didn't exist. They had moved on from that chapter of their family history and wanted no reminders of it. William's hands clenched into fists as he processed this information. Kate could see the anger building in his expression. Anger at the family members who had abandoned Sarah, her children, when they needed help the most. Elizabeth seemed to sense his emotional state, reached across the small table to touch his arm gently. "Please don't be angry with them," she said softly. "My mother spent years being angry, and it consumed so much of her energy. She eventually realized that bitterness was poisoning her life and her relationships with us children." Turned to another page in the album, revealing photographs of herself as a young woman in nursing school. "I became a nurse partly because I wanted to help people the way no one helped my mother when she needed it most. It seemed like the best way to honor her memory and turn something painful into something meaningful." William studied the photographs of Elizabeth's career, seeing images of her in various hospitals and clinics, often surrounded by colleagues who clearly respected and cared for her. There were pictures of her receiving awards for her service and photographs of her with patients, whose lives she had clearly touched. "You've had an extraordinary career," Kate observed. "Your mother would be so proud of what you accomplished." Elizabeth smiled, the first genuinely happy expression they had seen from her since their arrival. "I hope so. I always felt like I was carrying forward something of the Spencer family values, even though I wasn't acknowledged as part of the family. My mother taught me about service to others, about compassion, and about the importance of using whatever privileges you have to help those who have less." Elizabeth smiled, the first genuinely happy expression they had seen from her since their arrival. "I hope so. I always felt like I was carrying forward something of the Spencer family values, even though I wasn't acknowledged as part of the family. My mother taught me about service to others, about compassion, and about the importance of using whatever privileges you have to help those who have less." This struck Kate as profoundly significant. Here was a woman who had embodied the same values that had made Diana so beloved, despite growing up completely separate from the royal family and without any of the resources or guidance that Diana had received. "Tell us about your children," William said, his voice gentler now. "We'd like to know about the next generation of the family." Elizabeth's face lit up as she turned to a section of the album dedicated to her son and daughter. "James is a teacher in Glasgow," she said proudly. "He works with children from disadvantaged backgrounds, trying to give them opportunities they might not otherwise have. And my daughter Carolyn is a social worker in Edinburgh. She specializes in helping families in crisis." Kate noticed immediately that both of Elizabeth's children had chosen careers focused on helping others. It's continuing the family tradition of service that seemed to run through this branch of the Spencer family like a genetic trait. "They both know about today's meeting," Elizabeth continued. "They're nervous about the implications, but they're also excited about the possibility of being acknowledged as part of the extended royal family. They've grown up knowing they were descended from the Spencers, but they never imagined it might lead to something like this." Liam leaned back in his chair, processing everything he had learned. "I want to meet them," he said finally. "And I want our children to know about their extended family. This story shouldn't be hidden anymore." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for her friend Margaret's hand for support. "You certain?" she asked. "Once this becomes public knowledge, there will be no going back. My quiet life will be over, and your family will have new complications to deal with." Kate and William exchanged a look, and Kate could see that her husband had made his decision with complete certainty. "Family is family," William said simply. "My mother never had the chance to know you, but that doesn't mean we have to continue living with that separation. It's time to heal this old wound." 6 months after that emotional meeting in the Scottish cottage, William and Kate stood together in the same palace study where their journey of discovery had begun. But this time, the room was filled with people whose presence would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Elizabeth sat in the chair of honor near the fireplace, flanked by her children, James and Carolyn, who had traveled down from Scotland for this historic occasion. Across from them sat Michael and Patricia Davids, children who had flown in from Australia specifically for this gathering. The family resemblance was striking when they were all together in one room. A living testament to the Spencer family traits that had somehow survived decades of separation and thousands of miles of distance. Dr. Richardson was there as well, her genealogical research having been formally recognized by the College of Arms. The official documentation establishing the family relationships now bore the royal seal, making Elizabeth, James, Caroline, Michael, Patricia officially acknowledged members of the extended royal family. Most importantly, Charlotte, George, and Louis were present, having been carefully prepared for this meeting over the course of several weeks. Kate had been amazed by how readily the children had accepted the news that they had new family members, treating it as an exciting adventure rather than a complication. "Aunt Elizabeth," Charlotte said, using the title that had been decided upon. "After much discussion, will you tell us more stories about great-grandmother, Sarah?" Elizabeth's face glowed with happiness as she pulled Charlotte onto her lap. Over the past months, she had developed a special bond with William's children, who seemed to bring out a youthful energy in her despite her medical condition. The Alzheimer's progression had been slower than doctors had initially feared, possibly because having a renewed sense of purpose had given her motivation to fight against the disease. "Well," Elizabeth began, her voice taking on the storytelling tone she had perfected during her years as a nurse. Your great-great-grandmother Sarah was known for her beautiful singing voice. She used to perform at local events before she had to leave the Spencer family. James, Elizabeth's son, opened a folder he had brought with him. He actually found some recordings, he said, producing an old cassette tape. Mother made these. In the 1980s, singing some of the songs that Sarah used to perform. We thought you might like to hear your great-great-grandmother's favorite melodies. William accepted the tape with reverence, knowing that it represented yet another piece of his mother's family history that was being restored to them. These discoveries had been happening regularly over the past months, as Elizabeth's memory work and the family's research efforts had uncovered artifact after artifact that filled in gaps in the Spencer family story. Kate watched as Patricia, David's daughter from Australia, showed George a collection of letters that David had written to his mother over the years. Despite their separation, David had maintained correspondence with Sarah until her death. And his letters revealed a man who had never forgotten his family roots, despite building a successful life on the other side of the world, Uncle David wrote. About the Spencer family traditions, Patricia explained to George. He tried to maintain some of them in Australia, especially the Christmas customs that Sarah had taught him when he was young. Michael, the pediatric cardiologist, was showing Louis photographs of the Australian branch of the family. These are your cousins, he said gently. My children have been so excited to learn about their royal connections. They can't wait to meet you someday. The integration of these new family members into their lives had been surprisingly smooth. Elizabeth had moved to a small apartment in London, close enough to the palace that regular visits were possible but far enough away that she could maintain some privacy. Her children had taken turns staying with her, ensuring she had constant support while she adjusted to her new circumstances. The media attention had been intense initially, but the public response had been overwhelmingly positive. The story of the lost Spencer family members had captured imaginations around the world, and Elizabeth's dignity and grace in handling the spotlight had earned widespread admiration. Her background as a nurse and her children's careers in education and social work had reinforced the narrative of a family dedicated to service. Thomas Whitmore, whose genealogical curiosity had started this entire journey, was also present for this gathering. He had become something of a family historian, working with Dr. Richardson to continue uncovering Spencer family connections and stories. His research had expanded beyond the immediate family to include distant cousins and family friends who had preserved memories and artifacts from earlier generations. I have something special to share today, Thomas announced, reaching into his ever-present portfolio. Elizabeth and I have been working on a project that we think will be meaningful for everyone. He withdrew a beautifully bound book, its leather cover embossed with the Spencer family crest. This is a complete family history, combining everything we've discovered about Sarah's branch of the family with the known Spencer lineage. It includes photographs, letters, diary entries, and stories that span for generations. William accepted the book with obvious emotion. This is incredible, he said, flipping through pages that contained photographs he had never seen and stories he had never heard. My mother would have treasured this. Elizabeth stood and moved to a position where she could address the entire group. Despite her medical condition, she remained articulate and graceful, and Kate could see why she had been so effective as a nurse and leader in her community. I want to say something to all of you, Elizabeth began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through extraordinary circumstances. When my mother was forced to leave the Spencer family, she made me promise that I would never become bitter about what happened. She said that anger and resentment would poison any happiness I might find in life. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of family members from 3 different generations and 2 different continents. But she also made me promise that if I ever had the opportunity to heal the family wounds, I would take it. Today, surrounded by all of you, I feel like I've finally kept that promise. William stood and embraced his newly discovered aunt, and Kate could see tears in both of their eyes. The children gathered around them, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something important, something that would become part of their own family story. There's one more thing, William said, stepping back but keeping his hands on Elizabeth's shoulders. Kate and I have discussed this extensively, and we want to establish a foundation in Sarah's memory.
Yes.
It will focus on helping families that have been separated by circumstances beyond their control, providing resources for family reunification and support for children in crisis. Elizabeth's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "That's perfect," she whispered. "That's exactly what Mother would have wanted." Kate moved to join them, completing a circle that somehow felt both new and ancient. The Sarah Spencer Foundation will ensure that her story continues to make a difference in people's lives, she said. And Elizabeth will serve as our founding board member, helping us understand how to best honor her mother's legacy. As the afternoon light faded outside the palace windows, the newly reunited Spencer family members continued sharing stories, photographs, and dreams for the future. The children played together as if they had known each other their entire lives. The adults marveled at how naturally the family bonds had reformed despite decades of separation. Thomas quietly packed his genealogical materials, knowing that his work had accomplished something far beyond academic research. He had helped heal a family wound that had festered for generations, and in doing so, he had given William and Kate a gift that no amount of money or status could have provided: the knowledge that Diana's love and compassion lived on in family members who had never forgotten her, even from a distance. As the gathering began to wind down, Elizabeth pulled Kate aside for a private moment. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for welcoming me into the family, but for understanding how important this was for all of us." Sadness was that she never got to see her family whole again. Today, that dream finally came true,